In the heart of New York, in front of billionaire executives, a poor boy dared to challenge the most powerful man in the room. The millionaire laughed, certain the boy would be humiliated, but he didn't imagine that, within minutes, that laughter would turn into embarrassment in front of everyone. The glass and steel Blackwell International skyscraper, in the heart of Manhattan, stood imposingly as a monument to the power and ambition of 48-year-old Victor Blackwell, a man who shaped his technology empire with an iron fist and a heart as cold as marble. In that 70-story building, where the reflection of the clouds mingled with the glow of the city lights, decisions worth billions were made without the slightest hesitation. Victor liked to gaze out over New York from his penthouse, feeling at the helm of not just a company, but a global destiny. His hard expression, marked by lines of concern and arrogance, rarely betrayed emotion. That day, however, there was a particularly important meeting. International executives and investors from around the world were on their way to seal a deal of historic proportions. The atmosphere was buzzing with anticipation, and any sign of weakness would be immediately exploited. On the 55th floor, the meeting room was set up like a theater stage before the grand opening. Imported leather armchairs lined a polished oak table, where crystal decanters glinted in the soft light of the hanging chandeliers. Digital screens displayed real-time charts of the company's stock, while assistants scurried discreetly, adjusting details so that nothing deviated from the perfection Victor demanded. Here, every detail had purpose: the controlled temperature to keep the mind alert, the light wood aroma that conveyed stability, even the panoramic view of the city that reminded everyone where they were, at the center of the corporate world. Victor believed that image was almost as important as numbers, and his presence dominated the space as if he owned not only the room, but the very air within it. Guests arrived in luxury black cars, greeted with formal greetings by impeccably dressed hostesses. High-ranking Japanese, German, Italian, and American figures walked with leather briefcases and calculating looks, knowing they would soon witness something grand. Among them, whispers circulated about Victor's ruthless personality, a man who forgave no mistakes and never accepted defeat. For him, confidence was not an adjective, but a weapon, and that morning, he wielded it fiercely. The meeting promised to be a turning point for Blackwell International's expansion, but no one imagined that the spotlight on that story would not be limited to millions of dollars. A seemingly insignificant detail, hidden on the fringes of that empire, was about to become the trigger for a turnaround that would change everything. On the 55th floor, the heart of Blackwell International pulsed with an almost electric energy. The oval solid oak table reflected the golden light of the chandeliers, while leather briefcases and state-of-the-art laptops lined the screens of international executives and investors. The sum at stake, $200 million, was not just a cold number, but a figure capable of changing the fate of entire countries. Voices mingled in different languages, creating a chorus of anticipation that echoed off the room's glass walls. Every guest knew this gathering was not just another business meeting, but a spectacle of power, where every word could mean the gain or loss of fortunes. Victor Blackwell entered with firm strides, his face bearing the same expression of authority that had become his trademark. His tailored, graphite-toned suit resembled armor tailored to command respect. He cared nothing for likability, believing his position placed him beyond the need to please. Eyes immediately focused on him, and a reverent silence fell over the room. In the center of the table, the contract rested like a sacred piece, written in multiple languages, ready to be signed and cement Blackwell's expansion into Europe and Asia. The black ink pen, resting on a crystal stand, seemed to be waiting for the moment to seal that fate. Despite the solemnity, tension hung in the air. Some investors were unsure about specific details of the wording, especially a section written in complex, imprecise legal German. Quiet murmurs ran through the table, and the interpreters, hired at a high price, began exchanging nervous glances. Victor noticed the hesitation and frowned impatiently, as he didn't tolerate slip-ups at an event of this magnitude. The atmosphere of grandeur seemed to waver for a moment, and unease grew. Something was about to happen, something none of them could have predicted, and the outcome of that moment wouldn't be as those present had imagined. As the meeting unfolded with the gravity of a historic event, someone's presence silently clashed with the impeccable setting. Ruth Carter, 34, had arrived hours earlier, carrying a cleaning bucket and a worry in her heart about having no one to leave her son with. She was just another invisible employee among the gleaming corridors of Blackwell International. But that day her reality would intertwine with that of the powerful. Beside her walked Daniel Carter, 12, a boy with a curious and attentive gaze. Even dressed in simple clothes and carrying a worn backpack, he radiated an energy that contrasted with the seriousness of the surroundings. Ruth instructed him to remain silent, to keep his movements low, to almost disappear before the eyes of those who would never accept the presence of an ordinary boy in that sphere of wealth and power. Daniel sat in a discreet chair near the glass wall, from where he could see New York stretching to the horizon. The boy, despite his shyness, observed every detail. The impeccable attire of the executives, the words and languages he recognized from his books, and the public library he frequented daily, the nervousness of the interpreters struggling to maintain their composure. Ruth, though focused on her work, felt anxiety throbbing in her chest. She knew that her son's mere presence in a meeting of this level was a dangerous act of boldness, and she feared that Victor or one of his subordinates would reprimand her harshly. But there was no alternative. The lives of ordinary people rarely fit into the schedules of the wealthy. While the businessman leafed through the million-dollar contract and Victor Blackwell cast icy glances at everyone around him, Daniel remained silent, but his mind was racing. He recognized German words in the document projected on the screen, remembered passages of French he had studied, and even Italian phrases he had memorized from old recordings. Ruth, oblivious to what was happening inside her son, simply wished he would remain invisible until the end of that morning. Little did she know that discretion would soon turn into prominence, and that this simple boy, the product of nights of silent study and perseverance, would be capable of shaking the foundations of an empire that seemed untouchable. Victor Blackwell rested his hand on the oak table as he listened to the interpreter's hesitant translation, but his gaze strayed for a moment. In the corner of the room, almost hidden by the imposing space, he noticed the small figure of 12-year-old Daniel Carter, sitting silently, his battered backpack propped against the chair. Victor's expression hardened even further, his ice-cold blue eyes casting a silent judgment. To him, this place was an altar reserved for giants, and the mere presence of an ordinary boy wounded the aura of perfection he so zealously cultivated. The silence between speeches was filled with an invisible tension, as Victor's mind hammered home the discomfort of having his classroom contaminated by what he considered an unwanted distraction. Ruth Carter, busy discreetly wiping a side table, felt the weight of that gaze and cringed. She knew her boss's reputation, knew his rigidity didn't forgive mistakes, and that every detail out of place was seen as a personal affront. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wiped the glass, but her face remained firm, almost neutral, so as not to betray the turmoil she felt. Daniel, for his part, realized he was the target of attention and looked away, but not out of shame. There was a spark of pride in him, as if telling himself that, while he wasn't welcome, he wasn't inferior to anyone in that room. The atmosphere, until then dominated by discussions about clauses and investments, now seemed to carry an extra layer of tension. Victor returned to the contract, but the discomfort of the boy's figure throbbed in his mind. It wasn't just a distraction, it was a vivid reminder that the real world, made up of ordinary people and silent struggles, sometimes crossed the border of his armored kingdom of luxury. And like any wound to his pride, Victor wouldn't let it go unheeded. His contempt was just beginning, and soon it would become the trigger for something that would change the course of that meeting. The pages projected on the screen displayed long clauses written in elaborate legal German, the complexity of which went beyond literal translation. The American lawyers leafed through their copies with tense expressions, marking passages with pens that only scribbled more questions than answers. The hired interpreters, men and women of standing accustomed to dealing with international treaties, exchanged uneasy glances, trying to find equivalences that made sense without altering the legal weight of the words. But the more they tried, the more they stumbled upon technical terms that escaped common knowledge. The room, previously filled with the buzz of confident conversation, plunged into a heavy silence, as if the air had become too dense to breathe. Victor Blackwell drummed his fingers against the table, his expression wavering between impatience and irritation. For him, the delay was unacceptable. He was accustomed to immediate results, to flawless efficiency, and seeing qualified experts hesitate in front of everyone present filled him with contempt. His eyes swept the room like sharp blades, cutting through each face that tried to hide its insecurity. The contract was worth $200 million, and that small linguistic obstacle could not become a barrier that tarnished his image of perfection before foreign investors. The silence, which should have been a sign of reverence, now seemed to mock him. The wall clock ticked away the seconds almost cruelly, while those present held their breath, waiting for someone to take command of the situation. Victor leaned forward, his deep, sharp voice breaking the paralyzed atmosphere, demanding that the interpreters speak. But none of them could articulate a convincing response. The awkwardness grew like a shadow that spread throughout the room, reaching every corner. It was as if everyone were facing an abyss, waiting for someone to dare cross it. And it was precisely in this vacuum of hesitation that an unexpected voice, coming from where least expected, was about to speak. The dense silence that spread throughout the room was broken almost imperceptibly by a timid whisper from the back. Daniel Carter, 12, sitting in the chair closest to the glass wall, raised his voice slightly, though low, but clear enough to echo amidst the void of answers. "I know what it says." The phrase sounded out of place in that room filled with designer suits and framed diplomas from renowned experts, but at the same time, it brought an immediate chill, as if an unexpected spark had ignited the tension. Eyes turned almost in unison to the boy, and on each face was disbelief, some filled with surprise, others with indignation, as if it were an affront that he would dare speak in a territory forbidden to ordinary people. Victor Blackwell couldn't contain his reaction. First, he arched an eyebrow, and then, as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard, he let out a loud, dry, and contemptuous laugh. The sound of laughter cut through the room like a whip, echoing off the glass and wood walls. To him, the scene was too ridiculous to be taken seriously. How could a skinny boy in plain clothes even consider understanding a contract that had baffled interpreters and experienced lawyers? Victor looked at Ruth Carter, the boy's mother, with a wry smile that spoke volumes. To him, this was proof that ordinary people didn't know their place. Ruth felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, her heart racing as if she'd made an irreparable mistake simply by bringing her son with her. Her eyes silently pleaded with Daniel not to go any further, to withdraw and shut up before the humiliation became greater. But Daniel, despite the heat rising to his cheeks, stood firm, his fingers tightening on the straps of his backpack, as if seeking strength from something invisible. There was no bravado in his voice, only the calm conviction of someone who truly knew. The entire room waited, divided between the millionaire's laughter and pent-up curiosity about how far this boy would dare to go. The next moment would define not only his courage, but also the course of this meeting. Daniel looked up, his brown eyes reflecting the firmness of someone unwilling to back down. The boy's voice cut through the sarcasm-laden atmosphere, clear and unexpectedly confident. "I speak 4 languages, sir." The impact was immediate. Executives and interpreters exchanged incredulous looks, some containing sneers, others frowning in astonishment. The room, previously immersed in silent tension, erupted in murmurs and muffled laughter, as if the boy's courage were merely an inconvenient joke. For men accustomed to dealing with millions of dollars, the idea that a 12-year-old could master so many languages was simply unacceptable. Victor Blackwell, leaning back in his leather armchair, let out another laugh, this time even more tinged with sarcasm. His gaze narrowed, assessing Daniel as if observing a puppet daring to stand up to its puppeteer. For him, that moment was a rare opportunity to transform boldness into a spectacle of public humiliation. In a deep voice imbued with irony, he said he would let the boy try, already anticipating the moment when his fragile words would be ridiculed in front of influential men from all over the world. The game, in his mind, was already won before it even began, for he believed nothing of value could come from someone so small and insignificant. Ruth Carter felt her legs weaken, and the cleaning cloth nearly slipped from her hands. Her heart begged her son to remain silent, but something about Daniel surprised her, his lack of fear. The boy, who had spent entire nights studying in public libraries, absorbing words in German, French, Italian, and even Mandarin, now stood tall as if carrying within him a flame that no amount of laughter could extinguish. The room waited, divided between the spectacle of humiliation Victor expected and the almost improbable possibility that this boy might actually deliver on his promise. It was as if time had stopped, waiting for the first step that would change everything. Victor Blackwell leaned forward, crossing his fingers on the table as if waiting for a comedic performance. The contract was projected again on the screen, the legal German section still untranslated. Daniel stood slowly, his shoulders tense but his gaze steady, as if this were the moment his entire life had silently prepared him for. He took a few steps closer to the screen and, in a clear, measured voice, began to read and translate word by word. There was no hesitation, no stumbling. Every technical term was translated into English with precision, as if he had been born to decipher the language everyone present had failed to understand. A profound silence fell over the room. The professional interpreter, accustomed to being the official voice in highly prestigious settings, widened his eyes and put his hand to his mouth, unable to hide his astonishment. His mind searched for explanations. Perhaps the boy had memorized it beforehand. Perhaps it was a coincidence. But the fluidity and confidence with which Daniel articulated the translation made it clear there was no trick. He wasn't just repeating phrases. He understood what he was saying, extracting the exact meaning from subtext that even lawyers had feared interpreting. Gradually, whispers arose around the table, executives leaning toward each other, murmuring in surprised voices. Victor forced a wry smile, but the rigidity in his jaw betrayed the irritation beginning to seep through his usual confidence. What should have been a scene of humiliation was becoming, in front of everyone, an unexpected display of talent and confidence. Ruth Carter, standing in the back, felt her eyes well up, but she stood her ground, not allowing her emotion to betray her. Daniel, for his part, sat back down slowly, as if nothing had happened, simply breathing air back into the room. But the atmosphere had changed, and now the weight of the silence was no longer one of embarrassment, but of anticipation. Everyone waited to see how far this boy could go. Victor Blackwell slowly leaned back in his chair, his narrowed eyes reflecting a mixture of irritation and disbelief. The sarcastic laughter no longer came as naturally. In its place, a tone of calculated provocation emerged. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, ordering new sections of the contract to be opened in different languages. First in French, a lengthy paragraph laden with legal expressions that required not only vocabulary, but also deep comprehension. "Let's see if the prodigy can do that too," he murmured ironically, his deep voice resonating like a veiled challenge. The room, once again, plunged into suspense as eyes turned to the boy. Daniel took a deep breath, his heart racing, but his eyes remained fixed on the projected text. The French words, which to many sounded like a confusing jumble of elegant sounds, unfolded clearly in his mind. He began translating calmly, each sentence flowing from his mouth as if he were simply narrating something already familiar. The correct cadence, the confident tone, and the precision of the terms made even the most skeptical lean forward in their chairs, listening attentively. The French interpreter present couldn't contain his surprise, nodding in admiration. More intense murmurs spread among the executives, some smiling discreetly, others staring at Victor as if questioning the conviction he always carried. Uncomfortable, but determined to regain control of the situation, Victor ordered another section to be opened, this time in Italian. Again, Daniel didn't hesitate. The fluidity with which he translated was almost natural, as if the language were part of his daily life. He articulated each sentence clearly, flawlessly, without pauses of doubt, dominating the room as if he had been born in that place of power. The Italian investors present nodded, confirming the boy's accuracy. Victor, who had expected laughter at the boy's expense, now faced a room filled with admiration. But his mind still refused to accept defeat so easily. He silently prepared one last challenge, the cruelest of all, believing that this time the boy would have no way out. Victor Blackwell adjusted his jacket with slow movements, as if savoring his authority in front of everyone. His cold, calculating eyes fixed on Daniel Carter with the firmness of someone about to crush an opponent. With a crooked smile, full of contempt, he ordered the contract to be projected in Mandarin. The silence that fell was immediate, almost suffocating, for even the most experienced interpreters in the room knew this would be a nearly insurmountable barrier. For Victor, it was the final blow, exposing the boy's audacity to ridicule, drawing from the audience the laughter that would confirm his superiority and restore the natural order of things. In his mind, Daniel was nothing more than an intruder who had dared to shine where he had no place. Chinese characters spread across the screen like enigmas, indecipherable to most in the audience. Short, precise, and intricate lines, carrying centuries of culture and complexity, waited to be unraveled. Ruth Carter held her breath as she saw the projected symbols, her heart begging her son not to try, fearing the shame that might befall him. Executives exchanged discreet glances, some with expressions of pity, others with genuine anxiety. After all, if the boy achieved the impossible, they would witness an extraordinary feat. If he failed, he would be just another boy crushed by the arrogance of a corporate titan. Daniel remained silent for a few seconds, and this silence seemed to stretch time, as if each tick of the clock echoed throughout the entire room. His eyes ran over the Mandarin lines, and in his mind the symbols transformed into sounds, and the sounds into phrases he had seen so many times in scribbled notebooks and books borrowed from the public library. He took a deep breath and, without a tremble, began to translate confidently, transforming those indecipherable characters into clear, direct English. With each sentence, disbelief grew on the faces around the table. Victor, who had expected laughter, felt his laughter die in his throat. A new silence fell over the room, but this time it wasn't one of embarrassment. It was the anticipation of something no one dared interrupt. Daniel Carter took a deep breath, as if the air filling his lungs were the last spark of courage needed to sustain that moment. As his eyes scanned the Mandarin characters, memories of lonely nights in the public library surfaced, stacks of borrowed books, old recordings played over and over, pages scrawled with strange symbols he struggled to memorize. All of that, so many hours of invisible dedication, now converged on that moment. His voice echoed clear and firm, without hesitation, bringing to light the exact translation of each line, each legal term, with a naturalness that made what was unattainable for so many seem simple. Foreign executives leaned forward, their eyes wide in surprise. The Chinese representatives present exchanged quick glances and, with discreet nods, confirmed the impressive accuracy of Daniel's words. The interpreter hired for that language leaned back in his chair, almost defeated, unable to believe that a boy of only 12 was demonstrating such rare skill in front of everyone. The silence that had gripped the room was becoming something denser, a growing anticipation that kept everyone still, as if they didn't want to miss a single word. The translation, delivered flawlessly, sounded not only correct but magnificent, as if it were living proof that the impossible could happen. As Daniel concluded his last sentence, for a brief second, there was absolute emptiness, where only the distant sound of the air conditioning and the subdued beating of racing hearts could be heard. Then, like a wave breaking a dam, the room erupted in applause. Executives rose from their chairs, some smiling, others shaking their heads in genuine admiration. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the table, and the image of the frail boy who had dared to speak had become a symbol of something greater. Victor Blackwell, motionless in his leather chair, felt each clap echo like a direct blow to his pride. The room, now filled with the vibration of applause, no longer belonged to him, but to the boy no one expected to see shine. Victor Blackwell remained motionless for a few moments, as if the leather of the chair he was sitting in had become a prison. The man who had always cultivated an image of invincibility now felt a blush creep up his face, staining his fair skin an intense, unmistakable red. His jaw tightened, and his once haughty eyes discreetly averted themselves from the gazes that now held not reverence, but judgment. The laughter that had once echoed with such confidence had become a distant echo, a bitter reminder of an arrogance that had just been unmasked before everyone. For the first time in years, Victor experienced the bitter taste of vulnerability. The investors, who had previously bowed before his authority, now exchanged glances that varied between surprise and disapproval. Some whispered discreetly, observing the scene with expressions that betrayed their disappointment in the tycoon they so admired. Others simply stared at Daniel Carter with genuine admiration, recognizing in this boy a rare talent that defied any social prejudice. The room, still reverberating with applause, now seemed to pulse against Victor, who perceived, in each look, a silent sentence against his behavior. He had not only underestimated a young boy, but had exposed his own arrogance before influential men from around the world. Victor tried to compose himself, smoothing his jacket, forcing a smile that found no support even in his own expression. His heart, accustomed to beating with the cold rhythm of arrogance, now raced wildly, as if each beat betrayed his downfall. The billionaire's imposing figure seemed smaller, crushed by the weight of public humiliation. The man who had built an empire with an iron fist realized that, in that moment, he had lost something even more valuable than figures: respect. And nothing he said could erase the image everyone had just witnessed. His laughter had become a symbol of arrogance, and his defeat became inevitable. Ruth Carter stood near the glass wall, the cleaning cloth still clutched between her fingers. Her hands trembled slightly, not from physical exertion, but from the torrent of emotions that overwhelmed her. For years, she had walked the halls of Blackwell International like a shadow, invisible to those dressed in expensive suits and discussing figures she could barely imagine. But in that moment, as she watched her son being applauded by foreign executives, Ruth felt her heart swell almost painfully. Tears threatened to escape. but she held them back with the silent strength of someone who has learned never to show weakness in the face of power. Still, her eyes shone, reflecting a pride that no social barrier could erase. She remembered the endless nights Daniel spent studying under the dim light of a borrowed lamp, scribbling in old notebooks with symbols and words in languages she didn't understand. She had often wondered if all that effort would be in vain, if fate wouldn't crush her son's dreams as it had so often crushed her own. But there, before an audience of wealthy and educated men, Daniel proved that he was not only talented, but that his efforts had made him extraordinary. Ruth, for the first time, didn't feel like just the invisible cleaner of an empire. She felt like a mother, consecrated by the silent triumph that was now becoming public. Eyes in the room began to turn not only to the boy, but to her as well. Executives who had never noticed her presence saw her with new eyes, not as the woman who cleaned tables and windows, but as the mother who had single-handedly raised a brilliant son, capable of overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Ruth took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure, but deep within her, a flame was ignited, the certainty that this moment would never be extinguished. The invisibility that had shadowed her for so many years was dissipating, and in its place emerged the recognition she had always believed impossible. For the first time, she felt that her place in this luxurious environment was legitimate, even if earned by her son's talent. Amid the applause that still echoed through the room, the sound of a chair sliding against the shiny floor caught everyone's attention. Kenji Tanaka, 62, one of Japan's most respected investors, stood with a firm posture, his face serene, and his eyes filled with wisdom. Known for his discretion and for rarely speaking in public, his decision to speak unexpectedly broke the tension. He walked slowly to the center of the room, adjusted his dark blue jacket, and, in impeccable English, raised his voice for all to hear. He said he had rarely witnessed such clarity of mind in someone so young, and that it was proof that true intelligence is not limited to diplomas or inherited titles, but is born of dedication and quiet effort. Those present fell silent, attentive, as each word seemed to pierce the room like a bolt of lightning. Kenji continued, asserting that Daniel Carter had demonstrated more preparation and courage than many men in positions of power, and that his actions should serve as an example. Turning his gaze directly to Victor Blackwell, he didn't soften his criticism. With the cutting calm of someone who doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard, he declared that the billionaire's arrogance had only highlighted his fragility. Wisdom can blossom in the most unlikely places, he said. And today we all learned that through a boy who dared to believe in himself. The weight of his words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Victor, sitting in his armchair, felt the blow as if it were personal. His eyes avoided Kenji's, but everyone realized that this public rebuke could not be erased. Some investors nodded in agreement. Others murmured among themselves, reinforcing the idea that they were facing something beyond the mere realm of business. Ruth Carter, upon hearing those words, pressed her hands to her chest, trying to contain her emotion. Daniel, for his part, remained silent, but his expression carried a serene dignity that seemed to defy any attempt at belittling. The room, now, no longer belonged to Victor's power, but to the public recognition that greatness can emerge from where no one expects it. Victor Blackwell ran his hand over his tie, loosening it slightly, as if the silk knot had become a suffocating chain. He tried to compose himself, straightening his jacket, forcing a smile that found no response on the faces around him. The silence was different now. It was no longer one of expectation, but of judgment. He, who had always commanded meetings with an iron fist and confident laughter, had become a character in his own downfall. Every round of applause directed at Daniel still reverberated like a slap to his pride, reminding him that his scorn had become a symbol of defeated arrogance. Investors avoided him in the same way they had before. Some regarded him coldly, others with restrained contempt, as if they no longer saw the man who symbolized strength, but only the fragility of an exposed ego. Victor realized, with painful clarity, that he had lost something that cannot be bought: respect. His mind, accustomed to calculating risks and gains, understood what was at stake. It wasn't just the signing of $1 million contract that was crumbling, but the image he had built over decades. In that room, the man who once laughed above everyone else was now reduced to the silence of someone who no longer had the moral authority to lead. When his eyes, almost by accident, met Ruth Carter's, he felt a weight of shame he'd never experienced before. She didn't need to say anything. Her erect posture, her firm yet emotional gaze, spoke volumes. And as she looked at Daniel Carter, she realized not only the talent of a child prodigy, but the dignity he himself had lost amidst his arrogance. The billionaire who believed he controlled everyone's destiny discovered, there and then, that some downfalls are not financial, but human. And this one, before an astonished audience, would be remembered for a long time. The meeting room, once a scene of tension and arrogance, was now imbued with an atmosphere of hushed reflection. Every person present seemed to have engraved in their minds the scene they had just witnessed. A boy of just 12, from a humble home, invisible to the eyes of the powerful, becoming a symbol of talent and courage before men who moved billions. The glass walls, reflecting the Manhattan skyline, seemed to echo the message that had been instilled in that space. Greatness is not measured by bank balance, but by the determination that resists the barriers imposed by the world. Victor Blackwell's laughter, once deafening, now sounded distant, muffled by the weight of his own defeat. Ruth Carter, her eyes brimming with tears, the cloth still in her hands, lifted her chin with renewed dignity. For the first time, she felt fully seen, not as an invisible servant, but as the mother who had single-handedly raised a son capable of surprising the world. Daniel Carter remained silent, but his serene expression conveyed the confidence of someone who had achieved something greater than momentary recognition, genuine respect. He didn't need to say anything, for his presence already spoke louder than any speech. Among the foreign executives, whispers reverberated not about figures or clauses, but about how that day would be remembered, not for the signing of $1 million contract, but for the unlikely triumph of a boy against the arrogance of an empire. Thus, the lesson hung in the air like a truth impossible to ignore. Human worth isn't born of surnames or titles, but of the inner strength that insists on flourishing even in arid terrain. The millionaire laughed, believing he had mastered the game, but ended up swallowed by his own contempt, while the maid's son rose, consecrated by talent and courage. It was this unexpected turnaround, as powerful as it was inevitable, that transformed a moment of humiliation into a milestone of inspiration. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any moving stories. And, of course, leave a like, because it really helps the channel continue bringing inspiring stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support.